Imagine standing in the middle of a vast desert where endless dunes hide the remains of a city that once echoed with life. Streets, temples, and towering walls didn't disappear overnight. They were slowly swallowed by time, buried beneath centuries of shifting sand until history itself almost forgot they ever existed. But what happened here? What force erased an entire civilization so completely that only whispers remained? Tonight, we're uncovering the incredible story of the city swallowed by time and sand, a journey through lost civilizations, forgotten kingdoms, and one of history's greatest archaeological mysteries. Before we begin, if you enjoy exploring ancient mysteries, forgotten worlds, and the hidden stories of our past, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It really helps us bring you more fascinating journeys into history. Now let's travel back to a city the desert tried to erase forever. The first sign is never a wall rising above the horizon. It is a ripple in the sand that refuses to behave like every other dune around it. Wind has spent centuries smoothing this landscape into endless waves of gold, yet here the surface bends at strange angles. A line appears where nature rarely draws straight lines. A corner catches the morning light. Beneath only a few meters of drifting sand lies something the desert has tried to erase for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. An entire city waits below, silent beneath the weight of time, preserved and hidden by the same force that destroyed it. Standing here today, it is difficult to imagine that this empty wilderness was once filled with footsteps. Merchants guided long caravans through busy streets. Craftsmen hammered bronze beneath shaded courtyards. Children chased one another through narrow alleys, while priests climbed temple stairways before sunrise. Water flowed where now only dust moves. Trees cast shadows where nothing taller than scattered shrub survives. The silence feels permanent, yet it is only the latest chapter in a story that unfolded over countless generations. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Few sights are more unsettling than a city that simply disappears. Wars leave ruins, earthquakes leave broken stone, volcanoes preserve entire neighborhoods beneath ash. But deserts operate differently. They erase slowly. Their destruction is patient enough that one generation may hardly notice what the next begins to fear. A single storm deposits only a thin layer of sand. Another arrives months later, then another. Over centuries, buildings become hills. Roads vanish beneath drifting dunes, and memories fade alongside the landscape itself. Eventually, even the names disappear. The image of a lost city buried beneath endless sand has fascinated people for centuries. Travelers crossing great deserts have long reported glimpses of ruined walls appearing through heat shimmer, before vanishing again beneath blowing dust. Local traditions across North Africa, Arabia, Central Asia, and other arid regions speak of forgotten settlements swallowed after their people abandoned them or after nature slowly reclaimed them. Some stories contain impossible details, while others preserve surprising fragments of genuine history. Scholars remain cautious because legend often grows around abandoned places. Yet archaeology repeatedly demonstrates that beneath many of these tales lies a foundation of truth. The desert is often imagined as timeless, but it is one of the most dynamic landscapes on Earth. Sand is never truly still. Every grain moves with the wind. Every dune migrates. Some advance only a few centimeters each year. Others travel many meters, consuming everything standing in their path. Unlike forests or oceans, deserts rarely announce their movement dramatically. Their greatest power lies in their persistence. What survives one decade may vanish beneath the next 100 years of slow accumulation. This creates an extraordinary paradox. The same sand that buries a city can also protect it. Once buildings disappear beneath thick layers of dry sediment, sunlight, rainfall, vegetation, and human activity can no longer destroy them as quickly. Organic materials rarely survive in many climates, but in extremely dry environments, leather textiles, wooden objects, woven baskets, and even traces of food may endure far longer than expected. Walls remain standing because the surrounding sand supports them. Streets remain recognizable because nothing disturbs them for centuries. For archaeologists, such preservation offers an almost impossible opportunity. Instead of scattered stones reused by later civilizations, an entire urban landscape sometimes survives exactly where its last inhabitants left it. Storage jars remain inside abandoned homes. Workshops preserve unfinished tools. Doorways still connect neighbouring rooms. The evidence remains incomplete, and every excavation reveals only a small portion of what lies below, but what survives in the record allows researchers to reconstruct daily life with remarkable detail. Yet discovering these cities is extraordinarily difficult. A desert rarely advertises what it hides. From above, buried walls often resemble ordinary ridges. Ancient canals disappear beneath drifting sediment. Entire neighbourhoods blend seamlessly into surrounding dunes. Even experienced explorers have crossed directly over forgotten settlements without realising what lay beneath their feet. Only during particular moments does the landscape briefly reveal its secrets. Strong winds strip away recent deposits, exposing fragments of stone before covering them again. Heavy seasonal rains carve temporary channels through dunes, uncovering walls that may remain visible for only days or weeks. Satellite imagery, aerial photography, and ground-penetrating radar now provide new ways of identifying buried structures. But even these technologies cannot replace careful excavation. Every discovery begins with the suspicion that the desert is hiding something beneath its smooth surface. Human imagination naturally fills these empty spaces with extraordinary stories. Tales speak of cursed kingdoms punished by the heavens, golden cities overflowing with unimaginable wealth, civilizations destroyed in a single terrible night. Such stories endure because they transform slow, geological processes into memorable narratives. They give moral lessons to natural events. They explain disappearance through divine judgment or supernatural intervention. Modern archaeology paints a more complicated picture. Most ancient cities do not vanish because of one dramatic catastrophe alone. Instead, they experience long periods of adaptation before eventual abandonment. Climate shifts alter rainfall. Rivers change course. Trade routes move elsewhere. Political alliances collapse. Resources become increasingly difficult to obtain. Population slowly declines. Houses are abandoned one by one rather than all at once. No single explanation fully accounts for every lost city, because every civilization responds differently to mounting pressures. Even so, deserts possess a unique ability to accelerate forgetting. Once vegetation disappears and reliable water becomes scarce, people leave. Without constant maintenance, roofs collapse. Wind enters through broken openings, carrying fine sand indoors. Each season deposits another thin layer. Floors become invisible. Streets become shallow depressions. Courtyards transform into miniature dunes. After enough generations pass, newcomers crossing the region may never suspect that thousands of people once called this place home. The remarkable truth is that many deserts were not always deserts at all. Beneath today's barren landscapes lie the remains of ancient lakes, fertile valleys, grasslands rich with wildlife, and river systems capable of sustaining large populations. Geological evidence demonstrates that climates have shifted repeatedly across Earth's history. Regions that now seem permanently dry once supported forests, wetlands, and flourishing settlements. The desert surrounding our buried city was itself born from change, not permanence. That realization transforms the mystery completely. The question is no longer simply how a city disappeared beneath the sand. It becomes something far larger. How could an environment capable of sustaining thousands of lives change so profoundly that an entire civilization gradually lost its place within it? What decisions did its people make as familiar landscapes began to transform? At what point did they understand that the world supporting them for generations would never fully return? The answers do not begin beneath the dunes themselves. They begin long before the first walls were raised, when the landscape looked almost unrecognizable compared with the vast sea of sand stretching to every horizon today. Long before the first stone foundation is laid, before merchants count their goods beneath shaded courtyards, or priests climb temple stairways at dawn, the land itself tells a completely different story. The endless dunes that dominate the horizon today do not yet exist. Instead, seasonal rivers weave across broad plains, feeding shallow lakes that shimmer beneath the sun. Grass stretches across open ground where camels now struggle to find sparse vegetation. Herds of antelope, wild cattle, gazelles, and other grazing animals move through landscapes that resemble modern savannas, far more than the deserts they will eventually become. To modern eyes, this transformation seems almost impossible. It is easy to imagine deserts as eternal features of the planet fixed beyond the reach of history. Yet geology and paleoclimatology reveal a landscape that has changed repeatedly over thousands of years. What appears permanent is often only one phase in a much longer cycle. The evidence survives in layers of ancient lake sediments, fossil pollen trapped beneath the ground, abandoned river channels visible from satellites, and rock art depicting animals that could never survive in the present climate. Together, these clues reveal an astonishing truth. Entire regions that are now among the driest places on Earth once supported thriving ecosystems. Rain falls far more regularly than it does today. Seasonal storms refill rivers that flow across broad floodplains. Small wetlands form natural gathering places for wildlife, attracting predators, as well as early human communities. Fish thrive in freshwater lakes. Birds migrate between wetlands separated by only a few days of travel. Trees grow along riverbanks, stabilizing the soil and creating cooler microclimates beneath their canopies. For generations, human groups move through this landscape as hunters, gatherers, and fishers. They understand the rhythms of seasonal migration, the flowering of edible plants, and the behavior of animals that return to familiar watering places year after year. Their settlements remain relatively small, yet they develop an intimate understanding of the environment that later societies inherit. The land rewards careful observation rather than permanent occupation. Gradually, subtle changes begin to reshape this relationship. Some communities discover that certain wild grasses can be encouraged to grow near campsites. Others begin storing harvested seeds through dry seasons instead of consuming everything immediately. Simple storage pits become increasingly common. Temporary shelters remain occupied for longer periods. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that these changes emerge independently across different regions, each shaped by local conditions rather than a single revolutionary moment. Water becomes the decisive factor in every decision. Reliable springs allow families to remain in one place for months rather than weeks. Riverbanks offer fertile soils renewed by seasonal flooding. Nearby clay deposits provide material for increasingly sophisticated pottery capable of storing grains safely. Stone suitable for tools lies within manageable distances. Each practical advantage encourages people to invest more labor in permanent structures. As populations slowly grow, scattered settlements begin forming loose networks. Paths connecting neighbouring communities become familiar routes travelled by traders, messengers and families maintaining relationships across the landscape. Valuable materials rarely exist everywhere. Obsidian shells, decorative stones, pigments and high-quality flint circulate across surprising distances long before great cities emerge. Exchange spreads not only objects but also ideas, technologies and cultural traditions. The future city occupies a remarkably fortunate position within this evolving world. It lies near dependable water while remaining connected to routes linking distant regions. Travellers moving between ecological zones naturally converge here. Goods from mountains, river valleys, grasslands and distant coasts gradually pass through the same location. No grand master plan determines its destiny. Geography quietly provides advantages that accumulate over centuries. The first permanent buildings are modest by later standards. Houses consist primarily of mud brick strengthened with wooden supports and roofs, constructed from reeds branches and packed earth. Their builders possess no expectation that these structures will survive thousands of years. They simply seek protection from weather while remaining close to farmland and water sources. Each generation repairs, enlarges or replaces existing homes, slowly raising the ground level as accumulated debris forms artificial mounds beneath growing settlements. Life revolves around seasonal cycles that remain largely predictable. Floodwaters replenish fields. Crops mature beneath favourable conditions. Livestock graze nearby before returning to enclosed areas at night. Families share labour during planting and harvest, creating social bonds reinforced by mutual dependence. Religious practices emerge alongside agriculture, expressing gratitude for dependable rains, while acknowledging forces beyond human control. Shrines occupy central positions within growing communities, becoming places where practical concerns and spiritual beliefs naturally intertwine. The city itself does not suddenly appear. Instead, countless individual decisions gradually produce urban life. One family builds beside another. Workshops cluster near sources of raw materials. Storage facilities expand as harvests increase. Markets emerge wherever traders repeatedly meet. Paths become streets simply because enough feet follow the same routes. What later generations recognize as careful planning often begins through ordinary habits repeated over many years. Climate remains generous enough to support this gradual expansion. Rivers continue flowing. Vegetation stabilizes surrounding soils. Building materials remain accessible. Farmers occasionally face poor harvests, yet prolonged environmental collapse still belongs to an unimaginable future. Confidence grows because each successful generation assumes the landscape will continue behaving much as it always has. This confidence encourages ambition. Skilled craftsmen develop increasingly specialized occupations. Metal workers experiment with copper and bronze. Potters refine firing techniques that produce stronger vessels. Weavers create textiles valued far beyond their home settlement. Stonemasons learn to shape blocks with remarkable precision. Every improvement attracts additional trade, creating opportunities unavailable in smaller villages scattered across the surrounding countryside. Population growth transforms the social landscape as surely as rivers transform the physical one. Leadership becomes more organized. Systems for distributing water require cooperation extending beyond individual families. Disputes over land, livestock and resources demand agreed methods of resolution. Administrative traditions begin taking shape, laying foundations for institutions that will eventually govern thousands rather than hundreds. Even the skyline changes. Buildings gradually rise higher. Defensive walls appear around expanding neighborhoods, though their purposes likely combine protection, flood control, and symbolic authority. Public gathering spaces become larger. Storage complexes reflect increasing agricultural surplus. Travellers approaching from distant horizons immediately recognize this settlement as something different from ordinary villages, yet beneath every sign of prosperity lies an invisible dependency. Every house, every workshop, every temple, every market stall ultimately relies upon water continuing to arrive at the right time and in sufficient quantity. The city's growing confidence rests upon environmental stability that seems permanent only because it has endured for many generations. No inhabitant can yet imagine that winds crossing distant landscapes are already participating in climatic patterns capable of reshaping everything they know. The conditions that nurture civilization also contain the seeds of its future vulnerability. A larger population requires more farmland. Expanded agriculture consumes additional water. Trade depends upon predictable travel routes. Monumental architecture demands vast quantities of labor and resources. Success itself quietly increases dependence upon systems that become progressively more difficult to maintain if the surrounding environment changes. For now, however, none of these concerns overshadow daily life. The settlement continues expanding, drawing merchants from distant regions and transforming from an ambitious town into a city whose influence extends far beyond its walls. Its greatest years still lie ahead, built upon a landscape that seems endlessly generous, even as the first nearly imperceptible shifts begin deep within the natural world. Prosperity rarely announces itself with a single extraordinary moment. More often, it arrives quietly accumulating through hundreds of ordinary successes that eventually transform an ambitious settlement into a city whose influence reaches far beyond its own horizon. Generation after generation, the community grows larger, richer, and more confident. New neighborhoods spread beyond the earliest walls. Workshops multiply beside busy streets. Storehouses expand to accommodate harvests and imported goods. What once served as a regional gathering place gradually becomes a destination known across distant lands. Travelers approaching the city first notice movement long before they see its architecture. Caravans emerge across the surrounding plains in slow, deliberate lines, their animals carrying sacks of grain, woven textiles, copper ingots, carved stone, fragrant resins, dried fruits, precious pigments, and countless other goods. Every arrival brings not only merchandise but also news. Stories from distant kingdoms circulate through crowded markets. New techniques spread from one craftsman to another. Foreign customs appear in clothing, jewelry, and religious objects long before anyone thinks of them as influences from elsewhere. The city's greatest advantage lies not necessarily in producing the rarest resources itself, but in connecting places that possess different strengths. Farmers from fertile valleys exchange grain for finely crafted tools. Mountain communities bring stone unavailable in the surrounding lowlands. Coastal merchants transport shells, salt, and luxury goods inland. Metalworkers acquire ores from distant mines, transforming raw materials into objects worth many times their original value. Each successful exchange strengthens relationships that extend across hundreds of kilometers. Archaeologists often recognize this stage of urban development through subtle evidence rather than dramatic monuments. Pottery styles from multiple regions begin appearing together within the same households. Exotic stones reveal trade routes spanning remarkable distances. Chemical analysis identifies metals originating far beyond the immediate landscape. Even small decorative objects demonstrate that ideas, fashions, and technologies travel alongside commercial exchange. The city becomes a place where strangers are expected rather than feared. Inns and caravan stations develop near the main entrances. Merchants require secure places to store valuable cargo while negotiating prices or arranging onward transport. Animals need water, fodder, and shelter. Craftsmen specialize in repairing wagons, harnesses, containers, and tools damaged during long journeys. Entire occupations emerge solely because so many people pass through the city instead of remaining within it. Administration evolves alongside commerce. Trade cannot flourish without a degree of trust, and trust depends upon predictable systems. Officials supervise weights and measures to reduce disputes. Storehouses record incoming supplies. Taxes, whether paid in grain, livestock, labor, or valuable goods, support public construction and administrative institutions. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how these systems function, yet surviving records from comparable ancient cities suggest increasingly sophisticated forms of organization. Water continues to define every aspect of prosperity. Engineers improve canals and reservoirs, directing precious supplies toward expanding agricultural fields. Irrigation transforms nearby land into highly productive farmland, capable of feeding populations unimaginable only a few generations earlier. Farmers experiment with crop rotations suited to local conditions. Orchards spread along protected areas where fruit trees flourish. Livestock graze beyond cultivated fields before returning to enclosed pens each evening. The relationship between city and countryside grows inseparable. Rural communities depend upon urban markets to sell surplus harvests and acquire manufactured goods. The city depends equally upon surrounding villages for food, raw materials, and labor. Neither can thrive without the other. During successful years, this partnership appears stable, even natural. Few recognize how delicate the balance truly is. As wealth accumulates, architecture changes in visible ways. Earlier mud brick buildings remain common, but important structures become increasingly ambitious. Public squares expand. Administrative buildings occupy prominent locations. Temples rise above surrounding rooftops, their elevated platforms visible from considerable distances. Skilled builders decorate entrances with carved stone, painted plaster, polished wood, and intricate geometric designs. Monumental construction serves practical purposes while also expressing confidence in the city's future. Religious life reflects this growing complexity. Shrines that once served small neighborhoods become major ceremonial centers, attracting visitors from surrounding regions. Festivals coincide with agricultural cycles, reinforcing the belief that divine favor and environmental stability remain closely connected. Offerings accumulate within sacred spaces, providing archaeologists with valuable evidence about beliefs, trade networks, and artistic traditions. Scholars still debate many aspects of these ceremonies because written evidence is often limited, yet material remains suggest communities deeply invested in maintaining harmony between human society and the natural world. Daily life becomes increasingly specialized. Not everyone farms anymore. Some families devote themselves entirely to pottery production, perfecting kiln temperatures through years of experience. Others weave textiles so fine that they become prized exports. Metal workers master difficult techniques requiring enormous skill and patience. Stone carvers produce sculptures, architectural elements, and ceremonial objects that communicate status as much as craftsmanship. Children grow up expecting careers unlike those of their grandparents. Apprentices learn from experienced artisans inside workshops, filled with tools accumulated across generations. Knowledge passes directly through observation and repetition, rather than formal schools. Small improvements introduced by one craftsperson gradually spread throughout entire industries. Innovation rarely arrives dramatically. It emerges through thousands of careful adjustments made by people simply trying to improve their work. Markets provide the city's most vivid expression of prosperity. At sunrise, narrow streets fill with voices, animals, and the sounds of commerce. Fresh produce arrives from nearby farms. Bakers prepare bread using grain harvested only days earlier. Potters display newly fired vessels beside metalworkers polishing finished tools. Traders unpack foreign goods unfamiliar to many local residents. Aromas of spices, cooked food, leatherwood smoke, and livestock mingle beneath the warm air. Every transaction strengthens the invisible web connecting the city to landscapes stretching far beyond the horizon. Prosperity also creates inequality. Some households occupy spacious compounds, with private courtyards, storage rooms, and decorative features unavailable to ordinary families. Others live in modest dwellings clustered along narrow streets. Burials reveal differences in wealth through grave goods ranging from simple pottery to elaborate jewelry and imported luxuries. No civilization distributes success equally, and this city appears no different. Yet even modest families often participate in economic opportunities impossible within isolated villages. The city's reputation spreads. Travelers describe impressive buildings, reliable markets, and skilled craftsmen. Neighboring rulers seek alliances that secure access to valuable trade routes. Diplomatic gifts circulate alongside commercial goods. Cultural influences move in every direction, gradually blending traditions from multiple regions into something uniquely urban. To those living during these prosperous centuries, the future seems almost limitless. Every generation witnesses expansion greater than the last. Population continues rising. Trade networks grow denser. Public works become increasingly ambitious. Children inherit opportunities their parents could scarcely imagine. Success reinforces confidence that careful planning, hard work, and favorable conditions will continue producing similar rewards. Yet prosperity possesses an unexpected weakness. The more successful a city becomes, the more complicated its systems grow. Larger populations require greater food production. Expanded irrigation demands constant maintenance. Trade depends upon political stability across distant regions. Workshops rely upon imported raw materials arriving on schedule. Even slight disruptions ripple outward through increasingly interconnected networks. For now, these vulnerabilities remain largely invisible beneath the brilliance of success. Storehouses remain full. Markets remain crowded. Rivers continue flowing. The city's leaders see evidence that their achievements will endure for centuries to come. Hidden beneath that confidence, however, forces beyond any ruler's control are already beginning to reshape the landscape. The first changes are almost impossible to detect, but they will eventually determine whether this flourishing city remains a center of civilization or becomes another silent outline beneath an ocean of sand. At the height of its prosperity, the city no longer measures time by generations alone. It measures it by harvests, festivals, caravan seasons, and the steady rhythm of everyday life. Grand monuments may one day capture the attention of archaeologists, but they reveal only part of the story. The true strength of any ancient city lies in the ordinary routines repeated thousands of times by people whose names are now forgotten. It is within those routines that the city reaches its fullest expression, becoming not merely a collection of buildings but a living organism sustained by countless individual lives. Before sunrise, the city is already awake. Bakers prepare the first loaves while the air remains cool. Potters inspect kilns that have burned through the night, hoping that carefully controlled temperatures have produced vessels without cracks. Farmers arriving from nearby villages lead donkeys loaded with vegetables, grain, fruit, and bundles of reeds harvested along riverbanks. Water carriers begin their daily rounds before demand reaches its peak. Smoke rises gently above rooftops as hundreds of cooking fires come to life almost simultaneously. The streets gradually fill with movement. Narrow lanes that appear silent during archaeological excavation once carried an astonishing variety of activity. Children run errands for their families. Craftsmen transport unfinished goods between workshops. Officials inspect storage areas and public works. Herds of goats and sheep pass through designated routes toward grazing grounds outside the walls. Every path serves multiple purposes shaped not by formal planning alone, but by generations of repeated use. Excavated neighborhoods from comparable ancient cities reveal remarkable consistency in domestic life. Most homes are designed around central courtyards that provide light ventilation and a measure of privacy. Thick mud brick walls moderate the intense daytime heat, while retaining warmth during cooler nights. Flat roofs become valuable living spaces where grain dries beneath the sun repairs are completed, or families gather after temperatures begin to fall. These houses vary greatly in size, reflecting differences in wealth, yet they share architectural solutions developed through centuries of practical experience. Inside these homes, daily labor rarely stops. Grain must be ground into flour using heavy stone querns that require hours of repetitive effort. Water is stored carefully in ceramic jars designed to minimize evaporation. Clothing is woven, repaired, and cleaned by hand. Food preservation demands constant attention, because waste carries serious consequences in an environment where every resource has value. Archaeological discoveries often reveal worn grinding stones far more frequently than luxury objects, a quiet reminder that civilizations rest upon relentless ordinary work rather than extraordinary achievements alone. Women play central roles in maintaining households and supporting the broader economy. What survives in the record suggests responsibilities extending far beyond domestic tasks alone. Textile production, one of the most valuable industries in many ancient societies, frequently begins within homes before expanding into larger workshops. Preparing fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and producing finished garments require immense skill developed over years of experience. Textiles rarely survive the passage of millennia, yet loom, weights, spindle whorls, and specialized tools appear consistently throughout excavated neighborhoods, preserving indirect evidence of this essential labor. Children grow into responsibility early. Their lives are not divided sharply between work and education, as many modern societies understand these concepts. Instead, knowledge passes naturally through participation. A child accompanying a potter gradually learns how different clays respond to moisture. One assisting farmers recognizes seasonal patterns long before adulthood. Young apprentices observe experienced metalworkers shaping bronze or copper, absorbing techniques that written instructions could never fully communicate. The city continuously reproduces its expertise through countless moments of shared practice. Markets remain the social heart of urban life. Their significance extends well beyond commerce. News spreads rapidly among traders arriving from distant regions. Marriages are arranged between families whose businesses have grown interconnected. Religious festivals attract visitors who combine spiritual obligations with commercial opportunities. Musicians, storytellers, healers, and craftsmen all find audiences within these crowded public spaces. The city constantly renews itself through encounters between familiar neighbors and complete strangers. Food reflects the diversity created by expanding trade networks. Staple grains remain the foundation of most meals, supplemented by legumes, fruits, vegetables, dairy products, and occasionally meat. Wealthier households enjoy greater variety, including imported spices or luxury ingredients unavailable to ordinary families. Fish from nearby rivers contribute valuable protein, where water remains abundant. Archaeobotanical studies from ancient settlements reveal surprisingly sophisticated agricultural systems supporting varied diets, adapted to local environmental conditions. Religion quietly permeates everyday existence rather than remaining confined to monumental temples. Small household shrines occupy corners of private homes. Travellers offer prayers before beginning dangerous journeys. Farmers perform seasonal rituals connected with planting and harvest. Craftsmen seek divine favour before undertaking particularly difficult commissions. Public festivals unite neighbourhoods through shared ceremonies reinforcing both spiritual identity and civic belonging. Scholars still debate the precise meanings behind many recovered religious objects, yet their widespread presence suggests belief remains deeply woven into daily experience. Administration becomes increasingly visible as the city's population expands. Scribes record deliveries entering storage facilities. Officials supervise irrigation schedules that determine which fields receive water during critical growing periods. Builders inspect canals, roads, and defensive walls requiring continuous maintenance. Tax collection, however it is organized locally, supports projects benefiting the broader community. Such systems inevitably create tensions, but they also enable large urban populations to function with remarkable coordination. Craft production reaches extraordinary levels of specialization. Bronze workers operate furnaces requiring careful control of airflow and temperature. Stone masons shape blocks with increasing precision. Jewelers transform imported minerals into objects signifying wealth and status. Carpenters produce doors, furniture carts, and agricultural tools from timber that often travels considerable distances before reaching the city. Every finished object embodies invisible networks of resource extraction, transportation, technical knowledge, and skilled labour. One of the more surprising aspects revealed by archaeology is how interconnected ancient urban economies truly become. Chemical analysis of artifacts frequently identifies materials originating hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. A bead fashioned from distant stone, a shell collected along remote coastlines, or a metal alloy produced using imported ores demonstrates relationships extending far beyond political borders. The city prospers not because it exists in isolation, but because it participates in a remarkably extensive world. Even leisure carries social importance. As daylight fades and temperatures become more comfortable, families gather within courtyards or on rooftops. Neighbours exchange news gathered throughout the day. Artisans discuss recent commissions. Merchants calculate profits while planning future journeys. Musicians perform during festivals or communal celebrations. These quiet evenings strengthen the personal relationships that hold the city together just as securely as walls or administrative institutions. To later generations examining broken pottery and collapsed buildings, it is easy to imagine ancient cities primarily through their ruins. Yet during these flourishing centuries, the inhabitants rarely think about permanence. They repair damaged walls because tomorrow matters more than distant centuries. They expand workshops to meet growing demand. They plant orchards expecting future harvests. Every decision reflects confidence that the city will continue supporting those who come after them. This confidence is understandable. Prosperity has endured for generations. Markets remain crowded. Harvests remain dependable. Trade routes continue carrying wealth across vast distances. Children inherit a world that appears more stable than the one their grandparents knew. Success feels almost natural, as though the city's place within the landscape has become permanent. But landscapes possess memories longer than civilizations. The rivers nourishing fertile fields have shifted before and will shift again. Winds that seem harmless during prosperous years are slowly reshaping distant dunes. Rainfall patterns fluctuate so gradually that no single season appears alarming. The earliest signs of change remain subtle enough to dismiss as temporary misfortune. Only much later will people recognize that the ordinary routines sustaining this remarkable city have begun resting upon foundations far less secure than anyone realizes. The first warnings arrive so quietly that almost no one recognizes them as warnings at all. There is no single season when the rivers suddenly vanish, no dramatic storm that announces the beginning of decline, and no messenger carrying news that the city's greatest years have come to an end. Instead, the changes are scattered across decades, hidden within countless ordinary inconveniences that seem manageable on their own. Only with the benefit of hindsight do they begin to form a pattern. One spring the floods arrive slightly later than expected. Another year they do not spread quite as far across the fields. Farmers notice that some irrigation channels require more frequent clearing, because water no longer moves through them with the same force. Wells that once remained dependable throughout the dry season begin dropping lower before recovering after the rains. None of these developments seems extraordinary. Ancient communities are accustomed to natural variation. Good years alternate with poorer ones. Harvests fluctuate. Rivers have always changed with the seasons. The difference lies not in any single event but in the direction of the trend. Across many ancient civilizations, archaeological and geological evidence suggests that environmental change often unfolds over generations rather than within a single lifetime. Tree ring records, lake sediments, cave formations, fossil pollen, and ancient river deposits all reveal climates that gradually become warmer, cooler, wetter, or drier, depending upon region and era. The people living through these transitions rarely perceive the full scale of what is happening, because each generation compares conditions mainly with those remembered during childhood. The city's farmers adapt as they always have. Irrigation schedules are adjusted. Different fields receive priority during periods of lower water availability. Crops requiring greater moisture may be planted less frequently, while more resilient varieties become increasingly common. Storage facilities expand so that surplus harvests from favorable years can help offset disappointing seasons. These responses are practical and effective for a time. The administrators overseeing canals and reservoirs find themselves organizing maintenance projects with growing frequency. Silt accumulates in places where stronger currents once kept channels clear. Workers deepen sections of irrigation networks to preserve steady flow. New diversion canals are constructed in hopes of capturing every available drop before it escapes downstream. Such projects demand labor. Labor requires food. Food depends upon successful harvests. The city remains prosperous enough to support these efforts, but the relationship between natural systems and human society begins growing noticeably more complicated. Beyond the cultivated fields, subtle ecological changes become easier to observe. Grasslands that once supported abundant grazing begin shrinking in certain areas. Herds must travel farther to find reliable pasture. Trees growing along seasonal waterways show signs of stress during prolonged dry periods. Dust remains suspended in the air slightly longer after strong winds pass. Travelers crossing familiar routes remark that particular springs no longer flow as consistently as they once did. What survives in the archaeological record often supports these gradual transitions. Layers of windblown sand begin appearing more frequently within abandoned agricultural features. Fossil pollen indicates shifts from moisture-loving vegetation toward plants better adapted to increasingly arid conditions. Ancient lake beds shrink. River channels migrate or become intermittent. None of these indicators alone proves the decline of a civilization, but together they reveal landscapes undergoing meaningful transformation. Trade also begins showing subtle signs of strain. At first, caravans simply arrive less predictably. A journey that once required 3 weeks now sometimes takes 4 because animals must travel between more widely separated water sources. Merchants carry additional supplies, increasing transportation costs. Certain luxury goods become slightly more expensive, not because demand has increased dramatically, but because moving them across increasingly difficult terrain requires greater effort. Most customers hardly notice. Markets remain busy. Workshops continue producing. Life appears fundamentally unchanged. Yet experienced merchants, the people whose livelihoods depend upon recognizing patterns, before others do quietly begin adjusting their expectations. Some diversify their trading partners. Others invest in goods likely to remain valuable even if transport becomes more difficult. A few establish relationships with alternative routes that bypass increasingly unreliable regions. Such decisions rarely attract attention, but collectively they signal growing uncertainty beneath the surface of prosperity. Political relationships also become more delicate. Neighboring communities facing their own environmental pressures compete more intensely for access to dependable water-fertile land and established trade corridors. Alliances that once seemed permanent require continual negotiation. Border disputes become slightly more common. Competition for seasonal grazing grounds occasionally escalates into localized conflict. No major war erupts. No empire suddenly invades. Instead, countless small pressures accumulate across interconnected societies. Within the city itself, ordinary residents continue living remarkably normal lives. Children still learn family trades. Temples remain active. Markets continue filling each morning. Festivals celebrate successful harvest whenever they occur. Daily existence possesses extraordinary resilience because human beings naturally adapt to gradual change. Few people wake believing they're witnessing the beginning of collapse. Most believe next year will probably resemble the last. Perhaps the rains will return more strongly. Perhaps recent difficulties represent nothing more than an unusual cycle. Such optimism is understandable. After all, previous generations survived temporary hardships. Why should this time be different? Scholars still debate exactly which climatic mechanisms contributed most significantly to environmental change in many ancient desert regions. Variations in monsoon systems, shifts in atmospheric circulation, changing sea surface temperatures, long-term orbital cycles affecting solar radiation, and regional geological processes may all have played important roles. No single explanation fully accounts for every landscape or every civilization. What matters most is that the people living within the city possess no understanding of global climate systems. They observe only local consequences. A farmer notices lower river levels. A shepherd walks farther each year. A merchant spends additional days crossing increasingly difficult terrain. A builder discovers that fresh mud suitable for bricks has become slightly harder to obtain because nearby wetlands are shrinking. Each observation appears isolated. Together they describe an environment slowly moving toward a different equilibrium. The city's expanding population unintentionally magnifies every environmental fluctuation. Fields that comfortably supported 20,000 people may struggle to sustain 30,000 during weaker harvests. Irrigation systems designed for earlier conditions require continual modification. Firewood must be gathered from greater distances as nearby vegetation declines. Livestock consume increasingly scarce grazing resources. Success itself creates vulnerability. A small settlement can relocate relatively easily. A great city cannot. Its temples, workshops, canals, warehouses, and monumental architecture anchor it to one location. Its prosperity depends upon stability. Ironically, the achievements that once guaranteed security now reduce flexibility. The psychological impact develops even more slowly than the environmental one. Older residents remember greener landscapes from their youth. Younger generations accept drier conditions as normal because they have never experienced anything different. Conversations about changing weather become increasingly common, yet memories differ enough that no shared sense of crisis emerges. Human perception adjusts remarkably well to gradual decline. Modern researchers sometimes describe this phenomenon as shifting environmental baselines, where each generation unconsciously accepts the conditions it inherits as ordinary, making long-term deterioration difficult to recognize until profound changes have already occurred. The city stands at precisely such a moment. Its streets remain crowded, its workshops continue producing, its temples still receive offerings, its rulers maintain confidence. Visitors continue arriving from distant regions. Nothing about the skyline suggests imminent disaster, yet beneath every successful harvest lies a little more uncertainty than before. Beneath every caravan journey lies slightly greater risk. Beneath every repaired canal lies another reminder that nature is demanding more effort, simply to preserve what earlier generations received almost effortlessly. The city has not begun collapsing. Not yet, but the invisible balance between civilization and environment maintained successfully for centuries is slowly shifting. No inhabitant can see the full picture. Only the desert, moving grain by grain across the distant horizon, already knows the direction in which history is beginning to turn. The sand does not arrive like an invading army. It advances without banners, without noise, and without urgency. One gust of wind lifts only a handful of grains. A single storm reshapes the crest of a distant dune by little more than a few meters. Even an entire season of unusually strong winds leaves behind changes that seem almost insignificant when viewed individually. Yet the desert possesses something no civilization can match. It has time. Year after year, the landscape surrounding the city begins to change in ways that become increasingly difficult to ignore. The broad grasslands beyond the cultivated fields lose their rich cover of vegetation. Bare patches of earth appear where roots once held the soil firmly in place. During dry months, loose sediment is carried into the air more easily than before. Travelers returning from long journeys speak of familiar landmarks that now look strangely different, their outlines softened beneath fresh layers of drifting sand. At first, these changes remain largely outside the city's walls. Farmers notice them before merchants do. Shepherds recognize them before administrators. People who spend their lives close to the land develop an instinct for environmental change that rarely appears in written records but often determines whether communities adapt successfully or struggle. The most immediate concern is not the dunes themselves, but the shrinking reliability of water. Seasonal rivers continue flowing, yet their behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable. Some years produce respectable harvests, encouraging optimism that difficult times have passed. Other years disappoint badly enough to empty storage facilities more quickly than expected. The alternating pattern creates uncertainty rather than outright collapse. Engineers respond with impressive determination. Existing canals are widened, reservoirs are repaired and enlarged. New channels divert precious water toward fields that previously relied upon natural flooding alone. The city invests enormous labor in hydraulic infrastructure because every additional season of agricultural productivity strengthens hope that careful management can overcome environmental change. Ancient societies frequently display remarkable ingenuity when confronting natural challenges. Archaeological evidence from across the world's dry regions reveals sophisticated irrigation systems, underground water channels, terraced fields, reservoirs, and carefully engineered flood controls. These achievements demonstrate that early civilizations are anything but passive victims of climate. They innovate continuously. The inhabitants of this city are no exception. Skilled workers reinforce canal banks with stone where erosion threatens stability. Sediment accumulating within waterways is removed through coordinated labor organized by local authorities. Storage basins capture seasonal runoff that would previously have escaped unused across the landscape. Every successful engineering project postpones larger problems while reinforcing confidence that human effort remains equal to nature's demands. For many years that confidence appears justified. Harvest improve following extensive repairs. Markets recover after difficult seasons. Trade continues. Life regains a reassuring rhythm. Yet beneath these successes lies an uncomfortable reality. Each improvement requires greater investment than the one before it. Systems once maintained routinely now demand constant attention. Repairs become permanent features of public administration rather than occasional necessities. The city begins spending increasing amounts of its wealth preserving existing prosperity instead of expanding it. This distinction is subtle but important. Growth has quietly given way to maintenance. Beyond the irrigated fields, however, the desert follows no administrative plan. Wind continues transporting enormous quantities of fine sediment across the region. Without dense vegetation to stabilize the soil, exposed surfaces gradually surrender more material during every storm. Small dunes merge into larger ones. Existing ridges slowly migrate with prevailing winds. Ancient pathways require continual clearing as drifting sand accumulates across well-traveled routes. Caravan leaders begin adjusting their journeys. Routes that remain dependable for generations become increasingly difficult to navigate. Wells located between distant settlements sometimes fill with blown sand, forcing travelers to spend valuable time clearing them before drawing water. In extreme cases, wells are abandoned altogether because maintaining access becomes impractical. Every abandoned well reduces the range caravans can travel safely. Every altered route changes commercial geography. The effects spread outward through the entire regional economy. Merchants reaching the city now arrive with different stories than their predecessors. Some speak of villages relocating toward more reliable water sources. Others report shrinking lakes where fishing communities once flourished. A few describe stretches of countryside becoming noticeably harder to cross because shifting dunes obscure established landmarks. None of these reports suggests immediate catastrophe. Together, however, they describe a region undergoing continuous transformation. The city's administrators cannot ignore such developments indefinitely. Officials commission surveys of agricultural land to determine which areas remain productive. Tax assessments become increasingly complicated because harvests fluctuate more dramatically between neighbouring districts. Communities requesting assistance grow more numerous. Resources that once supported ambitious construction projects are redirected towards sustaining food production and maintaining water infrastructure. Ordinary families adapt in quieter ways. Households store larger reserves whenever harvests permit. Livestock numbers are adjusted to match increasingly uncertain pasture conditions. Some farmers experiment with crops requiring less water. Others abandon marginal fields entirely, concentrating their efforts on land closest to dependable irrigation. Adaptation occurs gradually, one practical decision at a time. Archaeologists often detect these responses through subtle evidence. Abandoned farmsteads begin appearing beyond the city's immediate surroundings. Irrigation channels show repeated phases of reconstruction before eventually falling into disuse. Windblown sand accumulates within formerly cultivated soils. Animal remains indicate shifts toward species better suited to drier conditions. Botanical evidence reveals changing agricultural strategies as communities respond to evolving environmental realities. What survives in the record suggests resilience rather than resignation. People do not simply surrender when conditions worsen. They work harder, they innovate, they reorganize, they hope. Hope, after all, has always been one of humanity's most durable resources. Religious life also evolves alongside environmental uncertainty. Ceremonies connected with rainfall, fertility, and successful harvests become increasingly significant. Temples receive offerings seeking divine favor during difficult seasons. Priests interpret unusual weather through spiritual traditions developed over generations. Scholars remain cautious when reconstructing ancient beliefs, yet evidence from many civilizations suggests environmental stress often deepens religious expression rather than weakening it. For those living within the city, practical effort and spiritual devotion complement one another. Repairing canals does not exclude prayer. Building reservoirs does not eliminate ritual. Both represent attempts to preserve the fragile balance upon which civilization depends. Despite mounting challenges, visitors arriving from distant regions still find much to admire. The city's walls remain impressive. Its markets continue attracting merchants. Its workshops produce respected goods. Public buildings are maintained with visible care. To an outsider spending only a few days within its streets, little appears fundamentally wrong. The greatest changes remain hidden beyond the urban centre, unfolding across the wider landscape that quietly sustains everything inside the walls. This illusion of stability becomes one of the city's greatest strengths and one of its greatest dangers. Because collapse has not arrived, suddenly leaders naturally assume further adaptation will remain possible. Previous investments solved earlier difficulties. Why should future ones not do the same? Yet environmental systems sometimes approach thresholds invisible until they are crossed. A river may appear stable for decades before shifting course dramatically. Vegetation may recover after several dry years until repeated stress finally overwhelms it. Groundwater may decline gradually before reaching levels that traditional wells can no longer access. Such thresholds are extraordinarily difficult to recognize while living through them. Modern science identifies many of these tipping points only through centuries of accumulated evidence unavailable to ancient observers. The people of the city possess only experience. Experience tells them that hardship comes and goes. Nature always fluctuates. The next rainy season may restore confidence. The next successful harvest may erase recent anxieties, and sometimes it does. The intermittent recovery delays more fundamental change. The desert, meanwhile, continues advancing with patient determination. Its dunes do not conquer through speed but through persistence. Each passing year deposits another thin veil across forgotten paths. Another abandoned field becomes partially buried. Another irrigation channel demands clearing. Another well fills with drifting sediment. No individual event seems historic. Together they reshape an entire civilization. The city still stands proudly against the horizon, bustling with life, and convinced that careful effort can preserve the world it inherited. But the sand has already begun rewriting the landscape around it grain by grain, making every future decision a little more difficult than the last. For a long time the city continues to look alive. Its walls remain standing. Smoke still rises from countless rooftops each morning. Merchants continue bargaining beneath shaded market stalls, and temple courtyards still fill during seasonal festivals. Anyone arriving for the first time would find little reason to believe that the settlement has entered the opening stages of its final decline. The greatest transformations are not visible from the city's gates. They are measured instead by absence. A neighborhood that once echoed with the sounds of children becomes unexpectedly quiet. A workshop that produced fine pottery for generations closes after its owner leaves in search of better opportunities elsewhere. One family abandons a distant farm, then another and another after that. Each departure appears insignificant on its own. Together they begin altering the social fabric that has held the city together for centuries. Archaeologists frequently encounter this pattern in abandoned settlements across the ancient world. Collapse rarely resembles the dramatic scenes portrayed in legend. There is often no single day when everyone gathers their belongings and departs forever. Instead, cities lose people gradually. The youngest seek opportunity elsewhere. Traders establish businesses along more prosperous routes. Farmers relocate toward regions with more dependable rainfall. Entire districts become only partially occupied long before the city itself is officially abandoned. What survives in the archaeological record suggests exactly this kind of uneven retreat. Some houses continue receiving repairs while neighbouring structures slowly deteriorate. Certain workshops remain active even after others have fallen silent. Storage facilities shrink in importance as agricultural production declines. Public spaces that once accommodated large gatherings begin serving noticeably smaller crowds. The city is not empty. It is becoming less full. This distinction matters because civilizations often remain remarkably functional, even after substantial population loss. Administrative systems continue operating. Religious ceremonies still take place. Trade survives, though, on a reduced scale. Daily life carries on with surprising normality, masking deeper structural changes unfolding beneath the surface. Merchants are among the first to recognize shifting realities. Trade routes have always evolved, but now the changes seem increasingly permanent. Caravans that once arrived weekly begin appearing less frequently. Some bypass the city entirely, choosing newer routes connected to regions where water remains more reliable and political conditions more stable. Commerce does not disappear overnight. It slowly changes direction. For a city whose prosperity depends upon acting as a crossroads, this gradual redirection carries profound consequences. Market stalls that previously displayed goods from distant lands now offer fewer imported luxuries. Local craftsmen struggle to obtain specialized raw materials that once arrived routinely. Prices fluctuate more dramatically because supply becomes less predictable. Skilled artisans continue producing beautiful work, yet fewer wealthy customers remain to purchase it. Economic decline spreads quietly. No great financial collapse occurs. Instead, opportunities slowly diminish. Young craftsmen complete apprenticeships only to discover that demand no longer matches the ambitions of earlier generations. Some leave voluntarily, carrying their knowledge to more prosperous settlements. Their departure weakens the city's productive capacity, further encouraging still more migration. This cycle reinforces itself. Every family leaving reduces demand for local goods. Reduced demand closes additional workshops. Fewer workshops create fewer opportunities. More residents decide to leave. The process unfolds over decades, perhaps even centuries, allowing each generation to believe the worst difficulties belong either to the past or the future, never fully recognizing the cumulative nature of decline. Agriculture becomes increasingly difficult to sustain at earlier levels. Fields closest to reliable irrigation remain productive, but more distant farmland is gradually abandoned. Maintaining long canals serving shrinking populations no longer makes practical sense. Labour once devoted to expanding cultivation is redirected toward preserving only the most fertile areas. From above, the countryside begins changing appearance. Cultivated fields contract toward dependable water sources. Former farmland becomes covered with sparse vegetation before eventually surrendering to windblown sand. Old irrigation channels remain visible for years as faint lines crossing the landscape, until drifting sediment slowly erases them. Satellite imagery of numerous ancient settlements today reveals precisely these patterns, frozen within the landscape long after human memory has faded. Inside the city, architecture reflects changing priorities. New monumental construction becomes increasingly rare. Existing buildings receive repairs using recycled materials recovered from abandoned structures nearby. Fine carved stone originally decorating one public building may appear years later reinforcing another. Timber grows especially valuable because acquiring fresh supplies has become more difficult. To modern observers, such reuse often signals practical adaptation rather than cultural decline. Ancient builders rarely viewed old materials as untouchable relics. They represented valuable resources. Yet widespread recycling also indicates that maintaining existing infrastructure has become more important than creating ambitious new projects. Social relationships evolve alongside economic pressures. Communities become smaller and more tightly connected. Families rely increasingly upon relatives and trusted neighbors during uncertain times. Shared labor grows even more important as available workers decline. Local traditions acquire renewed significance because they strengthen cohesion within shrinking populations. At the same time, inequality may become more visible. Some influential families retain access to productive farmland, establish trade contacts, or administrative authority. Others possess few resources beyond their own labour. Scholars still debate the extent of social inequality during periods of ancient urban decline, but evidence from many civilizations suggests environmental stress often magnifies existing differences rather than creating entirely new ones. Religious institutions continue providing stability. Temples remain among the best-maintained buildings in the city. Festivals preserve familiar rhythms despite mounting uncertainty. Offerings may even increase during difficult periods as communities seek reassurance through long-established spiritual traditions. Faith does not necessarily eliminate hardship. It helps people endure it. This resilience explains why ancient cities frequently survive environmental deterioration far longer than modern observers initially expect. Human beings are extraordinarily reluctant to abandon places layered with generations of memory. Every street contains family history. Every neighborhood preserves childhood recollections. Every cemetery connects the living with ancestors whose lives helped build the community. Leaving such places requires more than practical calculation. It requires accepting that the future no longer exists where the past unfolded. For many residents, that realization comes slowly. Older citizens often choose to remain even as younger relatives depart. They continue repairing familiar homes, tending surviving gardens, and participating in ceremonies that have structured life for decades. To outsiders, these actions might appear optimistic. In reality, they represent something deeper: attachment to place. Archaeology occasionally captures poignant moments from this stage of decline. A repaired doorway inside an otherwise abandoned neighborhood. Cooking vessels left neatly arranged within houses whose owners never returned. Tools carefully stored rather than discarded, suggesting expectation rather than surrender. Such discoveries remind modern researchers that people rarely recognize the exact moment they are living through history. The inhabitants do not believe they occupy a dying city. They believe they are surviving another difficult season. Perhaps next year's rains will improve. Perhaps trade will recover. Perhaps children who left seeking opportunity will one day return. Hope lingers long after prosperity fades. Yet the evidence accumulating across the landscape tells another story. More houses stand empty. More fields disappear beneath drifting sand. More caravan routes bypass the aging city. Silence begins settling over entire districts once filled with daily activity. The city still lives. Its heart continues beating. But each passing year removes another thread from the intricate web that once supported one of the region's great urban centers. Without dramatic battles or spectacular disasters, the process of abandonment gathers quiet momentum. The civilization has not vanished. It is slowly teaching itself how to leave. Eventually there comes a generation that inherits a city very different from the one its grandparents remember. The great walls still define the skyline. The temples continue to cast long shadows across familiar streets. The markets still open with the sunrise. Yet everywhere there are small reminders that the city has begun to outlive the world that once sustained it. Entire blocks now contain more empty houses than occupied ones. Doors remain standing, but few hands open them. Courtyards that once echoed with conversation are visited only by wind. The silence does not arrive all at once. It grows neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, until people begin adjusting their daily routines around spaces that no longer belong to anyone. The remaining inhabitants become experts at living within absence. Children take shortcuts through abandoned districts where their parents once had neighbors. Goats wander into empty courtyards in search of shade. Fallen roofs expose rooms that have not been entered for years. Plants no longer grow where irrigation has ceased, leaving only drifting sand to settle inside houses that had sheltered generations of families. Archaeologists often describe this stage as urban contraction rather than immediate collapse. The city does not simply stop functioning. Instead, it becomes smaller within its own boundaries. Residents cluster around dependable wells, productive workshops, and surviving public spaces, while neglected neighborhoods gradually surrender to decay. Evidence from many ancient settlements reveals precisely this pattern. Repairs continue in one quarter, while another is abandoned entirely. Religious buildings remain active long after surrounding homes fall silent. Administrative centers persist even as distant suburbs disappear beneath natural processes. The shrinking city becomes more efficient in some respects. Maintaining fewer streets requires less labor. Water can be concentrated where people still live. Public resources no longer need to support neighborhoods that have already emptied. Yet these practical advantages cannot reverse the larger forces reshaping the region. The countryside continues changing. Villages that once supplied grain disappear from tax records and trade accounts. Irrigation systems serving distant farms are no longer worth repairing. Some canals remain dry for years before filling permanently with wind-blown sediment. Others continue carrying water, but only seasonally, their flow too unreliable to support previous levels of cultivation. Every abandoned village weakens the city a little more. Every lost harvest reduces its resilience. Every departing family carries away skills, memories, and relationships that cannot easily be replaced. Trade has become a shadow of what it once was. Caravans still arrive, but many do so only briefly before continuing toward younger settlements that have inherited the commercial importance once enjoyed by the aging city. Merchants who previously established permanent warehouses now rent only temporary storage. Some no longer bother entering the city at all, exchanging goods at smaller settlements, positioned along newer routes. Economic geography is changing. The city itself has not become less impressive overnight. It has simply become less necessary. This distinction proves fatal to many ancient urban centers. Cities thrive because they solve problems. They provide markets, protection, administration, religious authority, and opportunities unavailable elsewhere. When surrounding conditions change enough that these advantages diminish, people gradually discover that life is possible, and sometimes easier in other places. No ruler can command geography to remain unchanged. No temple can restore vanished rivers. No marketplace can force caravans to travel roads that no longer make economic sense. The remaining population senses these realities even if they rarely express them openly. Parents encourage ambitious sons and daughters to seek opportunities elsewhere while quietly hoping they may someday return. Some never do. Those who leave often settle in growing towns where water remains plentiful and trade continues expanding. Their descendants remember stories about the old city, but increasingly regard it as the place their grandparents came from, rather than the center of their own future. Memory itself begins migrating. Within the city, maintenance gradually gives way to improvisation. Collapsed roofs remain unrepaired unless absolutely necessary. Building materials are recovered from abandoned neighborhoods instead of being quarried anew. Wood becomes especially valuable. Doors, roof beams, and structural timbers are carefully removed from empty houses to strengthen occupied ones. This recycling preserves parts of the city while simultaneously erasing other parts from the landscape. Modern excavations frequently uncover buildings constructed from stones and bricks, taken from earlier structures nearby. Such reuse speaks not of carelessness but of practical necessity. Every available resource matters. Even the city's defensive walls begin changing in purpose. Built originally to protect growing populations, they now enclose large areas containing little human activity. Maintaining their entire length requires more labor than the reduced population can easily provide. Certain gates fall into disuse. Sections damaged by weather receive only temporary repairs. The walls continue standing, but they increasingly protect silence rather than prosperity. Nature wastes no opportunity. As human activity retreats from abandoned neighborhoods, Wind gains access to spaces once shielded by constant maintenance. Sand collects against neglected walls. Doorways partially fill. Small dunes begin forming inside roofless courtyards. Each storm deposits another thin layer. No individual event appears remarkable. Decades later, however, entire rooms may lie buried beneath sediment carried grain by grain through broken windows and collapsed entrances. The process fascinates modern geomorphologists because it demonstrates how quickly natural landscapes reclaim built environments once regular human intervention ends. A swept courtyard remains clean. An abandoned one immediately begins changing. Without footsteps, vegetation repairs, or daily activity, every structure starts participating in the surrounding landscape rather than resisting it. The desert requires no intention. It simply follows the laws of wind, gravity, and time. Religious life persists with surprising determination. Temples often outlast commercial districts because they serve emotional needs extending beyond economics. Festivals continue, though, attended by fewer participants. Offerings remain carefully placed before ancient shrines. Priests preserve rituals inherited across generations, even as the communities supporting them grow steadily smaller. What survives in the archaeological record suggests continuity alongside decline rather than sudden spiritual collapse. People continue believing. They continue hoping. They continue marking the seasons. The city's identity survives longer than its prosperity. Eventually, however, practical decisions become unavoidable. Families faced with repeated poor harvests calculate risks differently than previous generations. Young couples considering where to establish households increasingly choose places offering greater security. Craftsmen relocate toward markets capable of sustaining specialized skills. Officials transfer administrative responsibilities to settlements growing in regional importance. None of these choices alone empties the city. Together, they create momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. The most haunting aspect of this stage is its normality. There are still weddings. There are still births. Children still laugh in occupied neighborhoods. Bread is still baked every morning. Life continues. It simply continues with fewer people each passing decade. The city has entered a peculiar state between existence and memory, too alive to be called abandoned, too diminished to recover its former greatness. Its remaining inhabitants cannot know exactly when the final family will eventually leave, but the desert patient, as always, has already begun preparing the streets for a different kind of silence, one in which no footsteps remain at all. There is no ceremony marking the end of the city. No final proclamation is carved into stone. No ruler stands before the remaining citizens to announce that centuries of urban life have reached their conclusion. History rarely offers such clear endings. Instead, the city slips quietly from the world of the living into the world of memory, and then with the passing of enough generations from memory into complete obscurity, the last inhabitants almost certainly believe they are leaving temporarily. Ancient communities abandon homes for many reasons. A failed harvest may force a family to relocate for several seasons. Merchants often travel for months before returning. Farmers establish temporary camps closer to distant fields during planting or harvest. Leaving does not necessarily mean saying farewell forever. For this reason, many archaeological sites preserve an extraordinary sense of interruption rather than conclusion. Objects remain carefully stored instead of discarded. Tools are placed where they might easily be found again. Large stone vessels are left behind because they are too heavy to transport. Doors are closed. Storage rooms are emptied of valuable supplies, yet ordinary household items remain exactly where they were last used. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests planning rather than panic. The city is not fleeing an immediate disaster. It is simply becoming a place where life is no longer sustainable. One household leaves, then another. The streets grow quieter. The market opens fewer days each season until eventually it no longer opens at all. The temple still receives occasional visitors, perhaps from nearby villages, perhaps from travelers honoring traditions that have not yet disappeared. Even after permanent residents leave sacred places often continue attracting people for generations. Reverence frequently survives long after ordinary urban life has vanished. Eventually, however, even these visits become rare. The wells that once sustained thousands begin serving no one. Without constant maintenance, wind deposits fine sediment into their openings. Masonry slowly weakens as small cracks expand through cycles of heat and cooling. Wooden beams decay or are removed for use elsewhere. Roofs collapse beneath their own weight after years without repair. Nothing dramatic occurs. The city simply stops resisting time. Once human maintenance ends, natural processes accelerate. Rainwater, though, infrequent, follows abandoned streets gradually eroding exposed foundations. Wind carries dust through open doorways until floors disappear beneath thin layers of sand. Seeds carried by birds or seasonal storms occasionally sprout in sheltered places before dying as conditions grow harsher again. Lizards occupy empty courtyards. Birds nest within broken walls. Small mammals explore storage rooms once filled with grain. The balance between human order and natural landscape begins reversing. For centuries, people reshape the environment to support urban life. Now the environment quietly reshapes the city. Modern geomorphological studies demonstrate how quickly abandoned settlements begin blending into surrounding terrain. Without sweeping repairs, drainage maintenance, or vegetation management, even substantial architecture changes appearance within remarkably short periods. Walls soften as corners erode. Streets become shallow depressions collecting wind-blown sediment. Buildings collapse inward, creating low mounds that later generations may mistake for natural hills. In dry regions, sand becomes the principal architect of forgetting. Each storm contributes only a tiny amount. Yet storms never truly stop. One season deposits a few centimeters against a neglected doorway. Several decades later, that doorway stands half buried. Another century passes. The upper lintel alone remains visible. Eventually, even that disappears beneath migrating dunes. The city does not sink beneath the earth. The earth rises around it. The process possesses a strange irony. The same dry conditions that encourage abandonment also preserve what has been abandoned. Inside sealed rooms protected by accumulating sand sunlight no longer reaches painted walls. Delicate pottery remains undisturbed. Organic materials survive far longer than they would in wetter climates. In some ancient desert settlements, footprints have remained visible beneath protective layers of sediment for astonishing lengths of time. The desert destroys visibility while preserving evidence. It hides history in order to protect it. Generations pass. Children born in nearby communities hear stories from grandparents about ruins somewhere beyond the dunes. The stories change slightly with each retelling. The city's real name becomes harder to remember. Distances grow uncertain. Buildings become palaces. Ordinary leaders become legendary kings. Periods of gradual decline transform into tales of sudden punishment or miraculous disappearance. Human memory naturally favors dramatic narratives over slow environmental change. A city abandoned across 2 centuries becomes in legend a city lost in a single night. Such transformations occur across cultures throughout history. Ancient trade centers become cursed kingdoms. Collapsed temples become the work of giants. Forgotten engineering achievements acquire supernatural explanations because their original builders have disappeared from living memory. Scholars still debate how much historical information survives within these legends. Some preserve surprisingly accurate geographical details. Others reflect moral lessons rather than actual events. No single explanation fully accounts for the remarkable persistence of lost city traditions across so many different civilizations. Meanwhile, the landscape continues evolving. Dunes migrate across former streets. Old irrigation canals vanish beneath layers of wind-blown sand until only faint variations in soil composition reveal their existence to modern scientific instruments. Seasonal rivers carve new courses far from abandoned fields. Animals establish patterns of movement that ignore boundaries once enforced by walls and gates. The city ceases to influence its surroundings. Its surroundings completely absorb the city. Centuries become millennia. Empires rise and collapse elsewhere. New religions spread across continents. Different languages replace older ones. Trade routes shift again and again. Travelers crossing the desert occasionally encounter isolated fragments of worked stone, emerging from dunes after unusually powerful winds. Some pause to investigate. Others continue their journeys, assuming the ruins belong to some forgotten caravan station or ancient shrine. Very few suspect that beneath their feet lies an entire urban world. Even those who recognize the presence of ruins rarely appreciate their true extent. Only the highest structures occasionally break through the sand. A corner of a defensive wall, the upper portion of a temple platform, scattered carved stones transported by erosion. The city itself remains hidden. There is something profoundly humbling about this stage of its history. For centuries, its inhabitants likely believed their achievements would endure indefinitely. Their monuments were built with confidence. Their streets reflected careful planning. Their institutions organized thousands of lives. Yet time measures success differently than civilizations do. Stone eventually weathers. Wood decays. Political systems disappear. Even names fade. What remains longest is often not power but evidence. A pottery shard. A buried foundation. A pollen grain trapped within ancient sediment. A forgotten inscription preserved beneath drifting sand. These quiet fragments wait patiently for future generations, possessing questions their builders could never have imagined. The city has now crossed an invisible threshold. It no longer belongs to history as a living place. It belongs to archaeology. The people are gone. The streets are buried. The silence is complete. Yet beneath that silence, protected by the very desert that erased it, the city is beginning an entirely different existence. One that will remain hidden until curious minds armed with patience and new ways of seeing the landscape begin searching for what time tried so carefully to conceal. For centuries, the buried city exists in a peculiar state between reality and imagination. It has not been destroyed completely yet, neither has it remained visible enough to be remembered with certainty. Beneath the shifting dunes, streets, homes, workshops, and temples wait in absolute silence, while the world above continues changing beyond recognition. Kingdoms rise and disappear. New trade routes replace ancient ones. Entire languages are born, evolve, and vanish. Through all of it, the city remains exactly where its last inhabitants left it, hidden beneath an ever-changing sea of sand. The people who now cross the desert know almost nothing about what lies below their feet. A caravan leader notices an unusual cluster of stones protruding from a dune after a powerful windstorm. He pauses briefly, perhaps assuming they belong to the ruins of an old watchtower or a forgotten campsite. A shepherd leading goats across the edge of the desert finds fragments of decorated pottery exposed by seasonal erosion. He collects one because it is beautifully made, never imagining it once rested inside the kitchen of a family that lived more than 1,000 years earlier. Small discoveries like these happen repeatedly across history. Very few lead to systematic investigation. Without maps, written records, or reliable local traditions, isolated ruins reveal little about the scale of what once existed. A single carved stone does not announce that an entire city lies buried nearby. It simply becomes another curiosity scattered across an immense landscape. Over time, stories begin filling the gaps left by fading memory. Across deserts throughout the ancient world, legends emerge describing magnificent cities consumed by sand, abandoned after divine punishment, swallowed by supernatural storms, or hidden to protect unimaginable treasures. These tales differ in detail, but often share remarkable similarities. A prosperous city grows proud. A mysterious disaster follows. Survivors disappear. The desert keeps the secret. Modern scholars approach such stories with caution. Legends evolve over generations. They combine fragments of genuine history with moral lessons, symbolic imagery, and imaginative embellishment. Yet archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that myths should not be dismissed entirely. Some preserve surprisingly accurate memories of landscapes, ancient roads, or settlements, long forgotten by written history. The challenge lies in separating memory from invention. A tale describing golden palaces may exaggerate wealth. A story about divine punishment may reflect real environmental collapse interpreted through religious belief. A legend claiming that an entire city vanished overnight may compress centuries of gradual abandonment into a single unforgettable event. Human memory rarely preserves slow change. It remembers dramatic endings. As centuries pass, travelers occasionally record unusual observations. Some describe isolated columns standing alone in the desert with no visible settlement around them. Others mention broken walls emerging briefly after violent sandstorms before disappearing again the following year. A few report wells lined with carefully cut stone far from any inhabited community, suggesting that the surrounding landscape once supported far more people than it does today. Such accounts are fascinating but frustrating. Most lack precise locations. Distances are estimated rather than measured. Landmarks disappear as dunes migrate. Directions that seemed obvious to one traveller become meaningless generations later. Even sincere eyewitnesses struggle to relocate places they visited only once. The desert itself contributes to this uncertainty. Unlike mountain ranges or river valleys, dunes are constantly moving. A landmark visible one decade may be buried the next. Entire ridges migrate slowly across the landscape under the influence of prevailing winds. In some regions, individual dunes travel several meters each year. Over centuries, this movement completely transforms the appearance of the surface, while leaving deeper, archaeological remains largely undisturbed. For explorers searching without modern technology, such conditions make locating buried settlements extraordinarily difficult. Some spend years chasing stories that lead nowhere. Others accidentally pass within a few hundred meters of remarkable archaeological sites without recognizing them. The city remains hidden not because it is especially remote, but because the desert disguises it so effectively. During later historical periods, interest in forgotten civilizations begins growing. Merchant scholars, pilgrims, and adventurous rulers collect stories about vanished kingdoms. Ancient manuscripts are copied and preserved. Geographers attempt to reconcile conflicting descriptions of distant regions. Maps become gradually more sophisticated, though large portions of the desert remain poorly understood. Occasionally written references mention prosperous settlements that no longer appear on contemporary routes. A place once famous for its markets is absent from later records. An important oasis simply disappears from administrative documents. The silence within historical sources becomes almost as significant as the information they contain. Something existed, then it no longer did. Exactly why remains uncertain. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, systematic exploration of many desert regions begins expanding rapidly. Surveyors, geologists, linguists, and archaeologists venture into landscapes previously known mainly through travelers' accounts. Their goals vary. Some search for ancient inscriptions. Others investigate geological formations. Still others hope to identify locations mentioned in classical texts or regional traditions. Many discoveries happen almost by accident. A strong wind exposes the corner of a buried wall. A local guide points toward unusual stone blocks protruding from the sand. A fragment of decorated pottery catches the attention of an experienced archaeologist, who immediately recognizes that ordinary campsites rarely produce ceramics of such quality. Excitement grows cautiously. Professional archaeologists understand how easily isolated ruins can be misunderstood. A collapsed building does not necessarily indicate a city. Scattered artifacts may represent centuries of unrelated activity rather than a single settlement. Careful excavation becomes essential. The first trenches often reveal surprisingly little. Only fragments of walls, broken pottery, animal bones, charcoal. Nothing spectacular. Then gradually patterns emerge. One wall aligns with another. A street begins taking shape. Additional buildings appear beneath neighbouring dunes. What initially seemed like an isolated structure expands into an organised urban plan extending far beyond the first excavation. Few moments in archaeology compare with the realisation that an entire forgotten city has survived beneath the surface. Every layer removed by careful excavation reveals another chapter sealed away for centuries. Doorways remain exactly where builders constructed them. Courtyards preserve traces of daily life. Workshops contain unfinished tools abandoned during the city's final years. Storage rooms still hold broken jars whose contents disappeared long ago. The evidence remains incomplete because excavation uncovers only a fraction of any buried settlement. Most archaeological sites remain largely untouched even after decades of research. Excavation itself is destructive. Once a layer has been removed, it can never be replaced. For this reason, archaeologists proceed slowly documenting every detail before moving deeper. Modern scientific methods transform these investigations. Radiocarbon dating helps establish chronologies. Microscopic pollen reveals ancient vegetation. Chemical analysis identifies trade networks spanning continents. Ground-penetrating radar detects buried walls without disturbing them. Satellite imagery exposes ancient streets invisible from ground level. Each new technique allows researchers to ask questions impossible only a generation earlier. The city begins speaking again, not through legends, not through myths, but through carefully preserved evidence waiting patiently beneath the sand. Its silence has lasted for centuries, yet it has not been empty. Every buried house, every forgotten street, every grain of wind-blown sediment has quietly recorded the long conversation between civilization and the desert. Now, for the first time in more than 1,000 years, people are finally beginning to listen. The first discoveries are exciting, but they are only fragments. A section of wall, a cluster of pottery, the outline of a building, none of these alone explains why the city flourished, how its people lived, or what finally caused them to leave. Archaeology rarely uncovers complete stories in a single season. Instead, every excavation adds another piece to an immense puzzle whose edges are still missing. As more of the buried settlement is exposed, an unexpected realization begins to emerge. The city is far larger than anyone first imagined. What initially appears to be a small administrative center gradually reveals itself as a carefully organized urban landscape extending beneath dune after dune. Streets intersect at deliberate angles. Residential districts occupy different parts of the settlement from workshops and public buildings. Open plazas connect neighborhoods that had remained hidden beneath the sand for centuries. The desert has not preserved isolated monuments. It has preserved an entire community. This distinction changes everything. For generations, historians often reconstructed ancient civilizations through the achievements of kings, monumental architecture, and written inscriptions. Those sources remain invaluable, but they tell only part of the story. A buried city offers something different. It preserves the lives of ordinary people whose voices rarely appear in official records. Inside modest homes, archaeologists recover grinding stones worn smooth by decades of preparing grain. Cooking vessels still bear traces of soot from countless meals. Storage jars reveal the kinds of crops families depended upon. Animal bones discarded after ordinary dinners provide evidence of diet, livestock management, hunting practices, and seasonal changes in food availability. Everyday life begins to reappear. Not dramatically, patiently. A broken spindle whorl suggests textile production inside a household. Tiny fish bones indicate that nearby waterways once supplied reliable food. Charred seeds preserved beneath collapsed walls reveal which crops were cultivated during different phases of the city's history. Each object appears ordinary in isolation. Together they reconstruct an entire way of life. One of archaeology's greatest strengths lies in its ability to recover information that ancient writers never considered worth recording. Kings celebrate victories. Administrators count taxes. Priests preserve rituals. Very few describe how children played what ordinary workers ate, or how neighborhoods organized daily routines. The ground remembers these things even when written history does not. Scientific analysis deepens this understanding even further. Microscopic pollen trapped inside ancient sediments reveals which plants once grew nearby. Some species require wetter conditions than exist today, confirming that the surrounding landscape was significantly greener during the city's early centuries. Phytoliths, tiny mineral structures formed within plant tissues, survive long after the plants themselves have disappeared. These microscopic remains help identify cultivated crops even where seeds have not survived. Soil chemistry exposes areas repeatedly used for livestock. Chemical residues inside pottery identify oils, fermented beverages, dairy products, and plant extracts once stored within sealed vessels. The city gradually becomes less mysterious, not because every question has been answered, but because thousands of small discoveries begin supporting one another. The evidence remains incomplete, yet consistent patterns emerge. Workshops reveal remarkable levels of specialization. Metalworking areas contain fragments of furnaces, slag crucibles, and unfinished tools. Their distribution suggests carefully organized industrial districts rather than random household production. Pottery kilns appear in clusters where prevailing winds safely carried smoke away from residential neighborhoods. Stoneworking debris accumulates near quarries or transportation routes suitable for moving heavy building materials. Urban planning proves more sophisticated than early explorers expected. This was never a chaotic settlement that simply expanded without direction. It evolved through generations of deliberate choices. One particularly fascinating discovery involves water management. Although rivers and canals no longer flow through the surrounding landscape, excavated infrastructure demonstrates extraordinary engineering skill. Stone-lined channels direct water towards storage basins. Reservoirs are positioned to maximize seasonal runoff. Drainage systems prevent flooding during periods of unusually heavy rainfall. Even private houses incorporate methods for collecting and conserving precious water. These systems remind researchers that ancient civilizations understood environmental challenges remarkably well. They were not careless users of natural resources. They actively adapted to changing conditions for centuries. Scholars still debate exactly how effective these adaptations remained during the city's final period, but the engineering itself reflects impressive practical knowledge. Religious architecture also offers valuable clues. Excavated temples contain carefully arranged offerings, carved altars, ceremonial vessels, and decorative motifs reflecting beliefs shared across generations. Some shrines appear to have been renovated repeatedly, suggesting long-term continuity rather than abrupt cultural replacement. Small household shrines discovered inside private residences indicate that spiritual life extended well beyond monumental religious buildings. Faith existed not only within temples but around cooking fires, courtyards, workshops, and family gatherings. Perhaps the most moving discoveries involve evidence of individual lives. A child's footprint preserved in ancient mud before being covered by drifting sand. A repaired ceramic bowl showing that its owner valued it enough to mend rather than replace it. A craftsman's unfinished project abandoned on a workbench during the settlement's final years. These moments compress thousands of years into something unexpectedly immediate. The people who lived here no longer feel like distant abstractions. They become recognizable human beings. Bioarchaeology contributes another important dimension. Human skeletal remains, when preserved and studied respectfully, reveal patterns of nutrition, disease, physical labor, and life expectancy. Bones record repetitive movements performed over decades. Teeth preserve evidence of childhood health. Stable isotope analysis helps identify diets, and in some cases even whether individuals grew up locally or migrated from distant regions. The city proves more diverse than previously assumed. Some residents likely arrived from neighbouring regions through trade marriage or seasonal migration. Its prosperity attracted people just as prosperous cities continue doing today. Trade networks become increasingly visible through scientific testing. Copper originates from distant mining districts. Certain decorative stones come from mountain ranges hundreds of kilometers away. Marine shells appear despite the city's inland location. Glass beads, pigments, and rare minerals demonstrate connections extending across surprisingly large areas. The buried city was never isolated. It participated in a vibrant regional economy linking landscapes that modern political borders often separate. Yet alongside these impressive discoveries comes another realization. No single piece of evidence identifies one definitive cause for the city's disappearance. The archaeological record refuses to support simple explanations. There is no widespread destruction layer indicating catastrophic invasion. No volcanic ash blankets the streets. No evidence suggests sudden annihilation. Instead, the material record reflects gradual adaptation followed by equally gradual abandonment. Some buildings remain occupied longer than others. Infrastructure receives repeated repairs before eventually falling into disuse. Agricultural evidence documents environmental stress unfolding across generations. The city's story grows more compelling precisely because it avoids dramatic simplicity. It reminds researchers that civilizations often end much as they live not through one extraordinary event, but through countless ordinary decisions shaped by changing circumstances. Each excavation season raises as many questions as it answers. Entire districts remain buried beyond the edges of current trenches. Remote sensing detects additional structures awaiting future investigation. Advancing technologies promise fresh insights into areas already studied. The city is not a solved mystery. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. Every carefully brushed artifact, every mapped foundation, every analyzed grain of pollen expands that conversation a little further. And with each new discovery, the buried streets become less like forgotten ruins and more like the preserved memory of a civilization that still has much left to teach the world. As the buried city slowly gives up its secrets, one expectation begins to fade. Many people hope archaeology will eventually uncover a single decisive answer, one dramatic event capable of explaining why such a prosperous place disappeared beneath the sand. It is an understandable hope. Human beings naturally search for clear beginnings and endings. A great battle, a devastating earthquake, a single season of unimaginable drought, a conquering army that leaves unmistakable traces behind. The evidence, however, tells a more complicated story. Every excavation, every laboratory analysis, and every newly exposed building points toward the same conclusion. The city's disappearance cannot be explained by one cause alone. Instead, it appears to be the product of several powerful forces acting together over generations, each one reinforcing the others until remaining in place became increasingly difficult. Climate stands at the center of nearly every discussion. By now, the environmental evidence has become difficult to ignore. Ancient lake sediments show changing water levels. Fossil pollen reveals shrinking woodland and expanding drought-resistant vegetation. Wind-blown sand appears more frequently in later archaeological layers. Former river channels become inactive or shift away from the areas that had once supported agriculture. These clues do not describe a sudden environmental catastrophe. They describe a landscape slowly becoming less forgiving. Modern climate science provides valuable context for understanding such transitions. Long-term changes in atmospheric circulation, shifts in monsoon intensity, variations in sea surface temperatures, and natural changes in Earth's orbital cycles can all influence regional rainfall over centuries. Ancient communities had no knowledge of these global processes, but they experienced their local consequences directly through changing harvests, declining rivers, and increasingly unpredictable seasons. Yet climate alone does not explain everything. History offers many examples of societies surviving difficult environmental conditions through adaptation, migration, technological innovation, or political cooperation. Drought creates pressure, but pressure does not always produce collapse. This realization leads researchers toward a broader interpretation. Environmental change weakens the city's foundations. Economic transformation magnifies those weaknesses. Political decisions determine how successfully people respond. Social inequalities influence who suffers first and who retains access to scarce resources. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened because no civilization depends upon only one system. Trade offers another important piece of the puzzle. The city rises to prominence partly because it occupies an advantageous position connecting different regions. Caravans move through its markets. Merchants exchange goods arriving from distant landscapes. Wealth flows not only from local agriculture, but from the city's role as a crossroads. Trade routes, however, are remarkably adaptable. If water becomes scarce along one corridor, merchants seek another. If maintaining caravans through a particular region becomes too costly or dangerous, commerce gradually shifts elsewhere. The city does not need to lose every trading partner. It needs only to become slightly less convenient than competing settlements. Economic geography can change quietly. A handful of caravans choose alternative routes. New markets emerge closer to reliable water sources. Younger settlements grow while older ones stagnate. Within a few generations, commercial importance has migrated without any dramatic historical event taking place. Political organization may also have played a significant role. Although the archaeological evidence rarely preserves detailed records of local administration, maintaining large irrigation systems requires coordination. Canals must be repaired. Reservoirs must be managed fairly. Labor must be organized during critical seasons. Periods of environmental stress make such cooperation more difficult. Communities competing for limited water often face increasing tension. Resources previously sufficient for everyone become subjects of negotiation. Scholars still debate the extent to which political instability contributed to the city's decline, but few doubt that effective administration becomes increasingly important as environmental conditions worsen. Population dynamics create another layer of complexity. During prosperous centuries, growth strengthens the city. Larger populations support specialized craftsmen, expanding markets, impressive architecture, and cultural innovation. During periods of decline, however, the same population becomes more difficult to sustain. Food demand remains high even as agricultural productivity decreases. Infrastructure built for thousands requires continual maintenance regardless of how many workers remain. Migration begins removing younger generations precisely when their labor is needed most. The city's greatest strength gradually becomes one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Archaeologists have also considered the possibility of disease. Dense urban populations always create opportunities for epidemics. Unfortunately, identifying ancient diseases from skeletal remains alone is extremely difficult, unless they leave characteristic marks on bone, which many infections do not. Current evidence does not support a devastating epidemic as the primary explanation for the city's abandonment, though localized outbreaks may certainly have occurred. The absence of convincing evidence is itself important. It reminds researchers not to fill gaps in knowledge with attractive speculation. Popular culture often prefers dramatic explanations. Lost cities inspire stories about mysterious curses, forgotten technologies, supernatural punishment, hidden treasures, or civilizations that vanish overnight under impossible circumstances. These narratives are entertaining, but they rarely withstand careful examination. The archaeological record consistently favors slower, more complex processes. The city disappears not because of magic. It disappears because civilization depends upon fragile relationships between people, water-food trade governance and landscape. When enough of those relationships weaken simultaneously, even remarkable societies struggle to endure. This complexity is one reason the city story remains so compelling. It mirrors challenges still familiar today. Modern cities also depend upon reliable water supplies. They rely upon extensive trade networks stretching across continents. Their economies assume environmental stability. Their infrastructure requires continuous maintenance. Their prosperity rests upon systems so interconnected that disruptions in one area often produce consequences far away. The ancient city becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a long-term experiment in resilience. Researchers increasingly view such settlements through this broader perspective. Instead of asking only why the city failed, they ask how it survived for so long despite mounting challenges. After all, environmental change begins generations before abandonment. Trade adjusts repeatedly. Water management evolves continuously. Communities innovate again and again. The remarkable story is not simply collapse, it is endurance. The inhabitants adapt for centuries before reaching the limits of what adaptation can achieve. That perspective transforms the narrative from one of failure into one of persistence. Every repaired canal represents determination. Every redesigned field reflects practical intelligence. Every surviving harvest demonstrates resilience in the face of uncertainty. Eventually, those efforts prove insufficient. But insufficiency after centuries of successful adaptation deserves admiration rather than dismissal. Perhaps the most valuable lesson emerging from the buried city is intellectual humility. Modern science has greatly expanded understanding of ancient climates, technologies, and societies, yet many important questions remain unanswered. Researchers continue debating the precise timing of environmental shifts. Different laboratories refine dating techniques. New excavation seasons uncover evidence challenging earlier interpretations. Fresh technologies reveal structures previously invisible beneath the sand. The city's story continues evolving because archaeology is never truly finished. Every answer creates new questions. Every discovery reshapes earlier assumptions. The buried streets still conceal countless details awaiting future generations of researchers equipped with methods not yet imagined. The mystery survives not because evidence is absent, but because the evidence describes a civilization far more intricate than any simple explanation can capture. Its disappearance reminds us that history is rarely written in straight lines. It unfolds through countless small decisions, gradual environmental changes, shifting opportunities, and the quiet persistence of people doing everything they can to preserve the world they know. As archaeologists compare the buried city with other ancient settlements scattered across the world's deserts, an unexpected pattern begins to emerge. At first glance, each place appears unique. They belong to different cultures, speak different languages, worship different gods, and exist centuries apart. Their architecture varies. Their political systems develop independently. Their histories unfold under different rulers and within different landscapes. Yet beneath those differences lies a remarkably familiar story. Again and again, civilizations flourish where water and geography create opportunity. They expand through trade, agriculture, engineering, and cooperation. They adapt successfully to changing conditions for generations, sometimes centuries. Then gradually, rather than suddenly, the balance shifts. Environmental pressures increase, economic networks evolve, populations migrate, urban centers shrink. Nature begins reclaiming spaces that human hands once maintained with extraordinary care. The buried city is not an isolated mystery. It belongs to a much larger history of how civilizations interact with changing landscapes. Across the deserts of North Africa, abandoned settlements mark the former edges of lakes that no longer exist. Satellite imagery has revealed forgotten river systems stretching across regions that today receive almost no rainfall. Archaeologists have uncovered villages beneath dunes where fertile valleys once supported thriving communities. Similar patterns appear in parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, and beyond, where cities dependent upon irrigation eventually faced environmental conditions far different from those that had nurtured their rise. Each site tells its own story. Together they tell something even larger. Civilization is not a fixed achievement. It is an ongoing relationship with the environment. Modern technology sometimes creates the illusion that humanity has escaped the constraints that shaped ancient societies. Massive dams redirect rivers. Underground aquifers supply expanding populations. Global shipping networks transport food across oceans. Satellites monitor weather systems in real time. Yet the buried city quietly reminds researchers that even the most sophisticated societies remain connected to natural systems operating on timescales far longer than any human lifetime. Water remains fundamental. Without reliable water, agriculture struggles. Without agriculture, urban populations become increasingly difficult to sustain. Without stable food supplies, economies weaken, migration accelerates, and political systems face mounting pressure. This sequence is repeated throughout history in countless forms, not because civilizations fail to understand water, but because changing environmental conditions continually reshape the limits within which human societies operate. One of the most striking lessons from comparative archaeology concerns adaptation rather than collapse. Ancient communities rarely remain passive when confronted with hardship. Instead, they experiment continuously. Some construct larger reservoirs. Others develop more efficient irrigation techniques. Some diversify crops to reduce risk during poor seasons. Others relocate portions of their population while preserving important cultural and religious institutions elsewhere. Migration itself often represents adaptation rather than failure. When people leave declining cities, they do not disappear. They carry knowledge, traditions, technologies, and social networks into new regions. The descendants of those who left this buried city almost certainly helped shape other communities. Their architecture may have influenced later settlements. Their agricultural experience may have improved farming elsewhere. Their stories, transformed by generations of retelling, may have survived as legends describing cities consumed by the desert. Civilizations rarely vanish completely. They change form. This understanding has reshaped archaeological thinking over recent decades. Earlier interpretations often described abandoned cities as evidence of sudden collapse. Contemporary researchers increasingly emphasize continuity alongside decline. People relocate. Trade networks reorganize. Political authority shifts. Cultures evolve rather than simply ending. The city beneath the sand therefore represents both an ending and a beginning. Its streets fall silent. Its people continue living elsewhere. Even the desert itself participates in this transformation. From a human perspective, the advancing dunes appear destructive. From a geological perspective, they are simply responding to changing wind patterns, vegetation cover, and sediment availability. The desert possesses no intention. It does not seek to erase civilizations. It follows physical processes operating over centuries and millennia. This perspective encourages a different way of thinking about the city's disappearance. Rather than imagining a struggle between humanity and nature, archaeologists increasingly recognize a changing relationship between the two. For centuries, environmental conditions support urban life. Later, those same conditions evolve. Human adaptation succeeds repeatedly before eventually reaching practical limits. Neither civilization nor landscape remains static. Both change together. The comparison with other lost cities also reveals something encouraging. Many abandoned settlements preserve extraordinary evidence precisely because they were deserted gradually rather than destroyed violently. A city burned during war often leaves only fragments. A city abandoned slowly may preserve entire neighborhoods. Daily life remains frozen not by catastrophe, but by patient accumulation of sand dust and silence. The desert becomes an accidental archive. Researchers studying ancient climate find equally valuable lessons. Sediment trapped within abandoned canals records changing flood patterns. Pollen preserved beneath collapsed buildings documents shifts in vegetation. Animal remains reveal evolving ecosystems. Even insect traces contribute information about moisture levels and seasonal conditions. Every buried city functions as a scientific record extending across centuries. It preserves not only human history but environmental history as well. Increasingly interdisciplinary teams collaborate to interpret these records. Archaeologists work alongside climatologists. Geologists analyze ancient river systems. Botanists reconstruct vanished landscapes. Chemists identify the origins of imported materials. Computer specialists create digital models allowing researchers to visualize neighborhoods still hidden beneath the sand. The mystery grows clearer because no single discipline attempts to solve it alone. Each contributes part of the answer. Public fascination with lost cities remains as strong as ever. Books, documentaries, novels, and films continue celebrating the romance of forgotten civilizations hidden beneath deserts. Some emphasize treasure, others highlight mystery. Yet the most compelling reality requires neither exaggeration nor fantasy. An ordinary family preparing bread beside a courtyard, engineers repairing irrigation canals during another difficult season, merchants debating whether to follow familiar trade routes or risk new ones, parents deciding whether their children should remain or seek opportunity elsewhere. These ordinary choices repeated across generations shape history more profoundly than dramatic legends. The buried city speaks most powerfully through those ordinary lives. It reminds us that every great civilization is built from countless small routines carried out by people who rarely imagine they are participating in history. The city's monuments are impressive. Its engineering is remarkable. Its trade networks stretch across astonishing distances. Yet its greatest achievement may simply be that it sustained human community for centuries within an environment that gradually became less hospitable. Eventually, that achievement proved impossible to maintain, but impossibility arrived only after extraordinary persistence. As researchers continue uncovering new districts beneath the dunes, they're no longer searching merely for the cause of disappearance. They are searching for the story of endurance, and in that story the buried city begins to resemble not an exception to human history, but one of its most enduring patterns. A reminder that civilizations are never separate from the landscapes that give them life, and that every grain of sand covering its forgotten streets carries within it the memory of both survival and change. Today the city no longer belongs solely to the people who once built it. It belongs to everyone attempting to understand how civilizations emerge, adapt, and eventually fade into history. Each new excavation season reveals another fragment of its story, yet it also raises new questions. Far from ending the mystery, every discovery demonstrates how much remains hidden beneath the desert. Modern archaeology has transformed the search for lost cities in ways that earlier explorers could scarcely have imagined. A century ago, researchers depended largely upon visible ruins, local traditions, and patient exploration on foot. Vast stretches of desert remained almost impossible to investigate systematically. If a city lay completely buried beneath several meters of sand, there was little chance anyone would ever find it unless chance intervened. That situation has changed dramatically. Satellite imagery now allows researchers to examine enormous landscapes from space, identifying subtle variations in soil color, vegetation, and surface texture that may indicate buried structures. Ancient roads, invisible at ground level, sometimes appear as faint linear patterns crossing the desert. Long-forgotten irrigation canals reveal themselves through differences in moisture retained beneath the surface. Even abandoned river channels erased from ordinary sight thousands of years ago become visible through remote sensing. What appears empty from the ground often reveals astonishing complexity from above. Ground-penetrating radar adds another layer of understanding. Without disturbing the site, archaeologists can detect walls, streets' foundations, and buried chambers lying beneath the sand. Magnetometry identifies ancient kilns, hearths, and fired brick structures because they interact differently with Earth's magnetic field than surrounding soils. Electrical resistivity surveys reveal hidden architecture by measuring how moisture moves through the ground. These technologies do not replace excavation. They make excavation far more intelligent. Instead of digging blindly, researchers can focus their efforts where evidence suggests the greatest discoveries await. Even so, excavation remains painstakingly slow. Every layer removed represents information that can never be replaced. An experienced archaeological team may spend weeks uncovering only a small section of one building. Every stone is photographed before being moved. Every artifact is carefully recorded. Soil samples are collected from different depths. Tiny fragments that appear insignificant today may answer important scientific questions decades from now, as analytical techniques continue improving. Patience has become one of archaeology's greatest tools. The buried city rewards careful observation rather than speed. Digital technology has also changed the way ancient settlements are preserved. Three-dimensional laser scanning records buildings with extraordinary precision before fragile walls deteriorate through exposure. Photogrammetry combines thousands of overlapping photographs into detailed digital reconstructions that researchers around the world can study without disturbing the original remains. Entire neighborhoods can now be explored virtually. Collapsed streets can be reconstructed digitally. Architects estimate the original heights of buildings using surviving foundations and engineering principles. Hydrologists simulate how ancient irrigation systems functioned under different climatic conditions. Computer models test competing explanations for urban development and decline. The city continues teaching long after excavation teams leave the site. Preservation, however, presents a difficult challenge. Ironically, the sand that concealed the city for centuries often protected it remarkably well. Once exposed, ancient mud brick walls face intense sunlight, changing temperatures, occasional rainfall, and increasing tourism. Materials preserved beneath stable desert conditions begin deteriorating surprisingly quickly when returned to the open environment. Archaeologists therefore face difficult choices. Should more of the city be uncovered if doing so increases the risk of damage? Or should large portions remain buried beneath the very sand that preserved them? Scholars still debate the best balance between discovery and conservation. There is no universal solution. Every excavation represents both an opportunity and a responsibility. Climate change introduces another layer of urgency. Many archaeological sites around the world now face increasing threats from stronger storms, changing rainfall patterns, expanding deserts, coastal erosion, and rising temperatures. The buried city, once protected by relative isolation, exists within a planet undergoing another period of environmental transformation. Its history suddenly feels less remote. Researchers increasingly recognize that ancient cities are not simply collections of artifacts. They are long-term records of how societies respond to changing climates. Their successes matter. Their failures matter. Their adaptations matter. These lessons do not predict the future, but they broaden humanity's understanding of what environmental resilience can look like across centuries rather than decades. Education has become one of the city's most enduring legacies. Students studying archaeology encounter it as an example of careful scientific investigation rather than romantic adventure alone. Climate scientists examine environmental records preserved beneath its streets. Historians compare its development with settlements across other continents. Engineers study ancient water management systems whose principles sometimes remain surprisingly effective in arid environments today. The city continues influencing the world despite having been abandoned for centuries. Its greatest contribution may not be gold monuments or spectacular treasures. It is knowledge. Every recovered artifact expands understanding of ordinary human experience. Every reconstructed building reveals practical solutions developed without modern technology. Every layer of sediment records another chapter in the conversation between climate and civilization. Public interest remains powerful because the story speaks to something deeply human. People imagine themselves walking through the restored streets. They wonder what sounds once echoed through the marketplaces. They picture families gathering within shaded courtyards as evening temperatures finally began to cool. These imagined moments are grounded not in fantasy, but in evidence patiently assembled over decades of research. The mystery has become more meaningful precisely because science has replaced many of the myths. Reality proves every bit as compelling. A city does not need supernatural forces to disappear. Time-changing landscapes and ordinary human decisions are more than enough. Standing today at the edge of the excavation, the contrast is striking. On one side lies the exposed city, its streets emerging once more beneath careful hands after centuries of silence. On the other stretches the immense desert still moving exactly as it did when the final inhabitants walked away. The dunes continue migrating. The wind continues carrying fine grains across the landscape. Nature has not stopped simply because archaeologists arrived. It never stopped at all. The buried city now occupies two worlds simultaneously. One exists beneath the open sky where researchers document every wall and artifact with extraordinary care. The other remains hidden beneath untouched dunes, preserving countless unanswered questions for future generations. Perhaps that is fitting. No civilization can ever be understood completely. There will always be another room left unopened, another inscription only partially preserved, another layer waiting beneath the sand. The mystery has changed. It is no longer about whether the city existed. It is about how much of its story still remains waiting to be uncovered, patiently protected by the same desert that once seemed determined to erase it. As the final pieces of the city's story come together, the mystery changes once again. It is no longer centered on where the city stood or even precisely why it disappeared. Those questions, while still important, begin giving way to something broader. The buried streets become a mirror reflecting the long relationship between humanity and time itself. Every stone uncovered from beneath the sand reminds us that civilizations do not exist outside nature. They exist within it, borrowing stability from landscapes that are always changing, even when those changes unfold too slowly for a single lifetime to notice. The city once seemed permanent. Its builders almost certainly believed that future generations would continue repairing the same walls, drawing water from the same canals, gathering in the same markets, and celebrating the same festivals. Such confidence was not arrogance. It was a reasonable expectation shaped by centuries of continuity. Every generation inherits a world that appears stable because the deepest changes often move more slowly than human memory. That illusion of permanence is one of history's most enduring themes. Across every continent, civilizations have constructed monuments intended to outlast those who built them. They carved inscriptions into stone rather than wood. They raised temples upon elevated foundations. They engineered canals, roads, fortifications, and public buildings with extraordinary skill. These works demonstrate remarkable foresight, yet even the most ambitious projects ultimately remain part of larger geological and climatic systems, extending far beyond human plans. The buried city does not represent failure. It represents participation in that larger story. Its people succeeded for centuries. They transformed a favorable landscape into a thriving center of trade and culture. They developed sophisticated water management systems. They established commercial connections stretching across distant regions. They adapted repeatedly as environmental conditions shifted around them. Their achievements lasted far longer than many modern cities have yet existed. Measured across human history, that is not a brief success. It is an extraordinary one. Modern archaeological research increasingly emphasizes this perspective. Instead of asking only why ancient societies collapsed, scholars ask how they managed to endure for so long despite continuous challenges. Environmental variability did not suddenly appear during the city's final years. Political uncertainty was never entirely absent. Trade networks constantly evolved, yet generation after generation found practical ways to adjust. Resilience deserves as much attention as decline. The city's final centuries reveal not helplessness but determination. Canals were repaired, reservoirs expanded, agricultural practices evolved, trade routes adapted where possible, communities reorganized around remaining resources. Migration occurred gradually rather than chaotically. Every response reflected people making rational decisions with the knowledge available to them. Eventually, those responses could no longer overcome the scale of environmental transformation. That reality does not diminish their efforts. It makes them more understandable. One of the most valuable contributions of archaeology is its ability to replace simplistic narratives with human ones. There were no mythical curses, no vanished magic, no mysterious force erasing civilization overnight. Instead, there were families deciding whether another difficult harvest could be survived, engineers calculating how to extend dwindling water supplies, merchants weighing the risks of increasingly uncertain trade routes, parents choosing where their children might build more secure futures. History is often shaped by such quiet decisions. The buried city also reminds us how easily memory can disappear. Its inhabitants certainly remembered the generations before them. They knew the names of ancestors, builders, leaders, and sacred places. Yet after enough centuries passed, even the city's own name slipped beyond recovery. The desert preserved its walls more faithfully than human memory preserved its identity. That contrast carries profound significance. Physical evidence can survive where stories do not. Equally, stories sometimes survive where physical evidence has vanished completely. Only by bringing archaeology, geology, history, climatology, and anthropology together can modern researchers begin reconstructing the fuller picture. The city therefore belongs not to one discipline but to many. Every scientific method contributes another voice. Radiocarbon dating establishes chronology. Ancient pollen reconstructs vanished ecosystems. Chemical analysis traces distant trade connections. Architectural studies reveal changing urban planning. Digital mapping uncovers neighborhoods still hidden beneath untouched dunes. Each discovery strengthens the others. No single artifact explains the city. The city explains itself through thousands of interconnected details. Its legacy extends far beyond archaeology. Urban planners study historical water management in arid environments. Climate researchers compare ancient environmental records with modern observations. Conservation specialists develop techniques to protect fragile ruins once buried safely beneath sand. Educators use the city to demonstrate how evidence rather than speculation gradually transforms mystery into understanding. Even so, some uncertainty will always remain. Entire districts are still buried. Future excavations will almost certainly revise current interpretations. New scientific techniques not yet invented may someday reveal information impossible to detect today. That openness to revision is one of science's greatest strengths. History is never frozen. Understanding continues evolving as evidence grows. Perhaps the city's greatest lesson is one of perspective. Human lives unfold over decades, civilizations over centuries, landscapes over millennia. The desert that buried the streets was already ancient when the first builders arrived, and it continues moving long after archaeologists have packed away their tools at the end of each field season. Time operates on many scales simultaneously. The people who lived here experienced changing weather, successful harvests, family celebrations, difficult years, hopeful recoveries, and gradual decline. The desert experienced only another brief chapter in its own much longer existence. Standing at the edge of the excavation today, one can imagine the remarkable contrast between past and present. Where archaeologists now brush sand carefully from ancient threshold, Merchants once hurried toward busy markets. Where researchers photographed foundations, children once played beneath the afternoon sun. Where silence now dominates the landscape, thousands of conversations once filled the air with ordinary life. Nothing supernatural separates those worlds. Only time. Time buried the streets. Time carried away the memory of their names. Time also preserved enough evidence for later generations to find them again. In that sense, the city was never truly lost. It simply waited beneath the dunes until curiosity, patience, and science became capable of hearing the quiet story preserved within its walls. The sand concealed it, but it could not erase it. The centuries silenced it, but they could not destroy it. Today its streets speak again, not through legends of impossible kingdoms, but through the careful work of those willing to listen to broken pottery, weathered stone, forgotten canals, and the countless ordinary traces left behind by people who built a thriving city, adapted with remarkable resilience, and ultimately became part of the landscape they once transformed. Their world disappeared from sight. Its lessons did not. The wind still moves across the dunes exactly as it did when the first walls were raised. It carries no memory of kings or merchants, no preference for triumph or decline. Grain by grain, season after season, it reshapes the surface of the desert with the same quiet patience that once covered streets, courtyards, and temples until an entire city disappeared from view. Yet beneath that silence, nothing is truly empty. The buried foundations remain where careful hands placed them. Ancient canals still trace paths toward rivers that have long since changed course. Pottery rests where families once prepared ordinary meals. Every layer of sand preserves a small fragment of lives that unfolded without any expectation of becoming history. The people who lived there could never have imagined that thousands of years later, strangers would brush away the desert one careful handful at a time, trying to understand how they built, adapted, struggled, and endured. Perhaps that is the city's greatest legacy. It reminds us that civilizations are rarely defined only by their greatest monuments or their most powerful rulers. They are sustained by ordinary routines repeated every day across generations. Water carried from a well, bread baked before sunrise, a canal repaired before the next planting season, a merchant setting out across familiar roads, parents hoping their children will inherit a safer and more prosperous world than the one they themselves received. For centuries those small acts were enough. Then the landscape changed. The people changed with it. Eventually they moved on, carrying their knowledge into new places while the city itself slowly settled into the embrace of the desert. What remained behind was not failure, but evidence. Evidence that even the strongest societies exist within a larger natural world. Evidence that resilience can last for centuries before reaching its limits. Evidence that time erases names far more quickly than it erases the quiet marks left by everyday life. Today the city has emerged once more not as a living place but as a conversation between the past and the present. Every excavation adds another sentence. Every new discovery reshapes another assumption, and beyond the edges of the trenches the dunes continue stretching toward the horizon, hiding stories that may still wait beneath their shifting surface. As daylight fades across the desert, the exposed stones slowly cool beneath the evening air. Shadows lengthen through streets that have not echoed with footsteps for countless generations. The wind passes gently over broken walls, carrying grains of sand that have witnessed empires rise, civilizations disappear, and curious minds return again in search of understanding. The city was swallowed by time and sand, but it was never completely forgotten. It simply waited long enough for history to learn how to find it again.